doing a disclaimer before I get started today. What I'm saying today are observations. I'm making observations as a third party. I'm the observations in the situations I'm using. I'm not taking sides or making judgments on them. I'm simply pulling back like a third party and going to talk about something that happened. And I'm not making judgments or taking sides on any of the examples I use. Last month was the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial in Tennessee. And one of our participants brought me an insert about the Scopes trial that came with the local newspaper. When I read it, I thought the issues it raised were so interesting and so current for today that I felt it would be good for us to talk about. Now, the Scopes trial is sometimes called the monkey trial because it was concerned with teaching evolution in the public schools. Now, in March of 1925, the Tennessee State Legislature passed a law that made it a crime to teach anything about creation in public schools except what is taught in the Bible. And the law specifically says you cannot teach evolution. Now, a number of other states had passed similar laws. Now, an organization called the American Civil Liberties Union was just getting going back then. It was in its infancy. They found out about this law in Tennessee. They found out about the laws everywhere. But they decided that Tennessee would be a good place to get involved in the hopes of having these laws declared unconstitutional. And so the American Civil Liberties Union sent letters to Tennessee newspapers saying that they were advertising for a teacher who would be willing to get arrested for teaching evolution in the public schools. And they wanted to use this as a test case to get the law declared unconstitutional. Now, they weren't asking anybody to volunteer to go to prison. It was just a misdemeanor with a $100 fine. So a guy named John Scopes, who was a biology teacher and a football coach in the small town of Dayton, which is sort of just a little bit below halfway between Knoxville and Nashville, he volunteered to do it. So Scopes got arrested for teaching evolution. And to be the prosecutor in this case, they got a man named Williams Jennings Bryan. Now, he was a guy who had served in the House of Representatives of the United States. He had run for president 3 times on the Democratic ticket, but never got elected. And he was the Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. He did not believe in evolution, and he did not like evolution. One of the reasons for that was that he felt the Bible taught something different, but there was another reason for it that a lot of people don't really think about it. Now, back then, in that time period of American history, American society was very unequal. There were relatively few very rich people and a lot of very poor people. This is also the time that many immigrants had come over to the United States, especially from the eastern parts of Europe. Many of these immigrants packed inside big cities where they lived in slums and ghettos and horrible conditions. They worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week in factories for practically no pay. And people looked at the condition these people lived in and they said, well, you know, these people are poor because they deserve to be. They're not smart. They don't live their lives right. And they're just sort of the dregs of society because they deserve to be. You see, this was a time in American history where it was thought that God wanted you to be rich. It was a time of the gospel of wealth. It was believed that the rich were rich because God smiled on them for being so smart and working so hard and living such good moral lives. And poor people were poor because they were lazy and lived immorally. And on top of that, people were looking at the different races in the United States. You had whites, blacks, Native Americans, Hispanics, and it was hard not to notice that everybody at the top were whites. And many people interpreted that as being that the white race represented the pinnacle of evolution, and that the other races were not as far as evolved as the white race. As Darwin said, it was the survival of the fittest, and it was obvious that the fittest were rich white people. And so the idea had come up related to evolution that, maybe we should help evolution out a little bit, speed it up, by not helping poor people. These people on the lower rungs of society, we should just let them stew in their own juice, and maybe they would become less numerous. But William Jennings Bryan was a champion of working people and people on the lower rungs of society, and he felt that the kind of thinking like that was emerging from evolution would be used by the upper classes as an excuse to keep second and third class Americans pushed down. And so that was his main reasoning against evolution. He felt it could be used as an excuse to keep some members of society pushed down. Now, the defense lawyer in this case, who the American Civil Liberties Union got, was a guy named Clarence Darrow. He's a non-Christian, a non-believer. He actually was anti-Christian, and his goal was to make Christians look like a bunch of backward, uneducated idiots. That's what he tried to do at the time. Now, this trial was the first trial to ever be broadcast live. It was broadcast live on the radio. Major newspapers throughout the United States sent reporters to town to cover the trial. It was the biggest public sensation America had ever seen. And remember that Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, wanted his client to be convicted because this was supposed to be a test case to try to get the law reversed on appeal. So in his closing remarks to the jury, he asked the jury to find the defendant guilty, which they did. Stokes was fined $100. And then Darrow appealed, hoping to get the law declared unconstitutional, but he didn't. Stokes was acquitted of the conviction on a technicality, but the Tennessee Supreme Court said that the law was constitutional, so they let it stand. Now, of course, later, the United States Supreme Court would step in and strike down all laws like that. So that's the Stokes trial. There are a number of reasons I found this interesting. The first reason is that it is right at the time when Christianity in the United States was undergoing profound changes. It was the time when the seeds were being planted in American Christianity that would eventually sprout and result in what we have today. It was the time when people were just beginning to grapple with the conflict between science and the Bible. And evolution was the first big issue in that. Many years ago, though, we talked about how that was not an issue in urban areas, in the big city. The Christians there were eager to latch on to anything from science. They did not want to be seen as a bunch of backwater dicks. They wanted to be seen as worldly, sophisticated, educated people. In their eyes, they were the cream of society. That's why they had risen to the top. They were better than everybody else, and they did not want to be lumped in with a bunch of stupid poor people who believed in the sixth-day creation. And so the people in the large congregations in the big cities, in practically all denominations, were eager to jump on the bandwagon of evolution. But people in rural areas, especially in places like East Tennessee, were not so quick to do that. And so you had these two sides. On one side, you had the non-Christians and the anti-Christians and the big city Christians who were all for evolution. And on the other side, You had most Christians who were not for evolution. This trial was the first big thing in the science against Christianity battle. But this thing brings up another issue that I think is even more important. Remember that the case involved what is taught in public schools. So the question became, who controls what children are taught in public schools? Should parents have a right to have a say in what children are taught? You know, at least on paper in this country, we have freedom of religion. If you want to go to a church where they teach a literal 6-day creation, you're supposed to be able to do that. You're supposed to be able to have the right to go and attend a church that teaches that. The question became, though, is whether the public schools then have a right to, on Monday morning, tell your child that what they were taught in church the day before is a lie. Do they have the right to do that? Now, we've seen this very same issue surface recently with the idea of homosexuality and transsexuality, and it caused quite a bit of consternation in schools across the nation. Now, those are issues about which 40 years ago there was no question, but today things have flip-flopped. Does the public school system have the right to teach your child that it's okay for them to have sex with someone of the same gender as they are? Does the public school system have the right to teach your child that if they feel they're a man trapped in a woman's body, then they actually are a man trapped in a woman's body and they should go with that? Keep in mind, I'm not taking positions on these. I'm merely using an overview of what happened. What rights do parents have to determine the moral values their children are taught? And in the Scopes trial, this was just as big an issue as the issue of evolution. And it's an issue that's still being argued today. There are some who say parents have no right to determine the values their children will be taught, and that at the present time seems to be the opinion that's winning out. I'm just pointing out here the conundrum that people got put into and still do when they see their children going to school and being taught values that are 180 degrees opposite to the values they want their children to have. You see, we used to have a culture in this country, pretty much a culture. There used to be basic agreement on at least some things. Not perfect agreement on things, but pretty much basic agreement on basic things. In fact, that's what defines a culture. A culture is a group of people with a common outlook, common values, and a common way of life. In that society, a society with a culture, public school systems pose no problem because they teach the culture. It is only when a society has no culture, when a society becomes composed of different groups at each other's throats and at loggerheads with each other, that it becomes a problem. When there are no shared values, when there is no shared way of life, who decides what values we're going to transmit to the next generation? You know, by the very nature of education, education transmits values. Education just doesn't transmit pure knowledge. It also transmits values. But if you have no agreement in society on values, if you have no culture, who decides what values get taught? If, as a parent, you do not want your children to be exposed to the values they are being taught, what do you do? I'm not trying to come down on the public school system. I'm not against the public schools. It's just that this was the first avenue where parents realized they were losing control of the values their children were taught. In earlier times in the United States, children received most of their education at home from parents or other family members, whatever the education might be. And they received most of their education in values from their parents and family members. But then society changed. Industrialization happened. People went to work for 12 to 15 hours a day in factories. Public schools came on the scene, and all of a sudden parents found we have lost control of what our children are being taught. It wasn't values that they wanted their children to have. It was other people teaching them values. And it was the circumstances surrounding this Scopes trial that really brought this into focus for most people. This opposition to teaching children evolution in the public school was really the first big pushback in that, as it finally dawned on parents that their children were being taught values they did not want them to have. You better believe that the American Civil Liberties Union and Clarence Darrow realized it. You see, they knew that if you change children, you change society. If you want to make a big change in values of a society, don't bother with changing the values of adults. Don't even think about the adults. Just let the adults be. Concentrate on the children. All you have to do is instill values in children, and in 20 years, you've changed society. I heard a teacher remark some 40 years ago that the public school system was called upon to integrate society. And that's true. That teacher was absolutely right. It was a time when virtually nothing in society was integrated other than schools. The schools were called upon to integrate society. And it was no accident that desegregation began in school. You see, because if you realize you can change children, you change society, that's where it goes. And so things aimed at children are the real target for those who want to change society. It's just that the public school system happened to be in the position of being the first big other outside influence on children, the first avenue in which other people taught people's children values. Now today, with technology and stuff, there are many others. Children get their values from online stuff. They get their values from television programs and from movies, from the music they listen to. They get their values from all over the place. They even get their values from advertising. A number of years ago, I was sitting in the dentist waiting room, and I picked up a magazine. I think it's something like Business Week or some of those business magazines. There was an article in there about a woman who was an advertising executive. She developed major ad campaigns for big, huge companies. And she said that when they develop an ad campaign, they develop it with the idea that children will see it. Now, we're not talking about advertising campaigns for toys or stuff like that. We're talking about advertising campaigns for lawnmowers or toys or cars or whatever. I guess pharmaceuticals is about all they advertise on TV now, but I guess that too. So even though children are not going to buy any of that stuff, still the children are going to see that stuff. And she said that whenever they develop an ad, they always look at how they can insert something in there that will impart some kind of values to children. The important thing to realize is that they are targeting children to impart values. The characters they put in there, what the characters are doing, what the characters look like, what the characters are saying, the situations the characters are in. You see, they can take all of that to produce values in children. When children, age 7 years old, are sitting there and a commercial comes on, those children are being targeted for values. It's not just the stuff they see on the internet in secret when their parents aren't looking that teaches them value. It's the stuff they see when everybody's sitting there watching the movie and a commercial comes on. They're being targeted like that. Now here's another example from television, not from ads, but from just regular shows. Now before I say this, keep in mind, I'm being as a third party today. I just use this stuff as an example. Not criticizing him. I know that some of our participants watch Hallmark movies. Have you noticed lately that Hallmark movies have same-sex couples in them? Do you know that? That was not true 4 or 5 years ago. It really wasn't. One that I started noticing about 4 or 5 years ago. It was like somebody just put a little pepper in it, occasionally. People start seeing that over and over again in Hallmark movies, and children see it. People see it so much that after a while, it begins to seem natural. Children see it so much that after a while, it's natural. If you grow up seeing something, don't you think it's natural? Now, on this issue, it doesn't matter whether you are all for same-sex couples, whether you can't stand it, or whether you don't care one way or the other. It doesn't matter. The point is that being in those Hallmark movies is no accident. It's no accident. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that you can boil a frog alive if you just put it in a pot on the stove and then turn the stove on low and let it heat up slow. It'll heat up so slow that the frog never realizes anything's wrong until it finds it's boiled to death. But if you throw a frog in hot water, turn around and jump out. You see, if we see things a little at a time, drip by drip, we get accustomed to it. And eventually we think, well, that's normal. Evolution used to be a hot topic in Christianity. It's not anymore. In 1940, you could not have gone into any of the big churches around here and spoken in support of evolution. They would not have put up with it. You would have been shown the door very fast. 85 years ago, 85 years after that, though, today, if you went to the prestige churches in Shelby, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't accept evolution. That's how things have changed. Of course, there are fundamentalist churches on the outskirts that haven't changed, but in general, American Christians have moved on. In the conflict between science and the Bible, science won. It won first in the prestige churches of the large cities. Then it won in the seminaries and in the upper hierarchy of the denominations. It took 60 or 70 years to trickle down to the small churches in places like Grover and Cherville and Bellwood and Ellenboro, but it finally trickled down. You see, the adjustments Christianity made back then to accommodate science did not just affect scientific issues like evolution. It affected how Christians look at the Bible on everything. Some of them are moral issues, some are Bible interpretation issues, some are worldwide issues, political issues. But whatever the issue, we've seen a very slow, gradual change during our lifetime. So slow we didn't even notice it was happening until all of a sudden we thought, what changed? Where it all started was when Christianity changed to be able to be on the side of science in the war between science. There's something called a graveyard spiral that pilots sometimes get killed. It's something like this usually happens at night when the visibility's not too good. And you get somebody in there at night, the visibility's not too good, they're not too sure where they're going, trying to look down half the time, and not paying all that much attention. You let that plane get a little back. Can't breathe out. Don't even notice it. It keeps banging. You're not paying attention. You're paying attention to something else. You're looking around. You can't hardly see out. Foggy sort of. You can't see out. Let the plane get a little bit back. Then it gets a little bit more back. And it stays there for a while. You stay there for a while. Then you inner ear gets used to that. Then you look down and you think, oh, I'm turning. Straighten back up. Well, you know when you straighten back up what you think? You think you're turning in the opposite direction. Because you've been in this gentle turn for so long, your inner ears got used to that, and then when you straighten that plane up, let it down, you'll think, oh, I'm turning to the right now. So what they'll do is they'll straighten out, and then they'll think, oh, I'm turning to the right now, so turn back to the left, and they'll keep turning, keep turning. You'll feel like you're straight, but you're not. You're turning, and then a spiral will go. Call it graveyard spiral. And it's not an unusual thing to happen to lifetime pilots of mine. You see how it changes if they're slow and gradual enough that we slowly get used to it, or gradually stay on. We don't think there's anything wrong with it. It feels okay. I'm not in pain. I'm straight. I can tell I'm straight. Just right before they hit the ground. If somebody comes up and says, look, there's something wrong here, you say, you're crazy, there's nothing wrong. This is the way it should be. Why? Because we've gotten used to it after little by little over many years. Don't think it was an accident. It was not. Now, as I said, I did not do this to speak to any of the issues that I talked about today. I did it because I wanted you to have an understanding of what the time that we lived in our lifetime was one of the most, it's probably more determinative of Christianity in the future than will have been the Protestant Reformation. And so you have lived through a time, hundreds of years from now, when people look back and now say, that's when it changed. You've lived